Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third in the North Wessex Downs AONB Spring webinar series on farming and the environment. I'm Henry Oliver, Director of the AONB. Our subject today is getting to know your soil. My own interest in soil actually only was sparked probably about 2 years ago when I went to the Groundswell No-Till, Min-Till farming conference for the first time. And I found it absolutely fascinating. I'm still on a virtually vertical learning curve. I'm really looking forward to today's talk. Just a bit of housekeeping before we kick off. We will, I hope, have time for questions after Jenni's talk. Please, you should see at the bottom of your screen an icon that says Q&A. And if you type your questions in there at any time, we will then do our best to get through as many as we can when we get to the Q&A session. Apologies if we don't manage to get to yours. This is part one of 2 talks that Jenni's running for us. And so there will be an opportunity to flag up subjects that you'd like her to address in the second one. And at the end of today's session, we'd be very grateful if you would give any thoughts you have about what you'd like covered, what you're interested in, any other questions you have in the feedback survey as you log out of the webinar. So I just now need to welcome our speaker. Professor Jenni Dungait is a globally renowned soil scientist with 20 years of academic research experience in soil biogeochemistry, and is now working as a freelance consultant after establishing the Soil Health Expert in 2018. She's an honorary professor at Scotland's Rural College, an associate professor in the College of Life and Environmental Sciences at the University of Exeter, as well as finding time to be a fellow of both the Institute of Soil Science and the Royal Society of Biology. And if that wasn't enough, she's currently editor-in-chief of the European Journal of Soil Science. She has a passion for science communication and knowledge transfer, working widely with researchers in soil science and with partners in the agricultural industry. So I'm sure this is going to be a fascinating introduction to finding out more about your soils. And the presentation will cover what tools you can use to assess the health of your soil, positive indicators, signs of degraded soils, soil carbon, and a whole lot more. As I say, Jenni will welcome your feedback on this talk and will want to know what else you'd like her to cover for her second presentation on the 15th of April. So you're very welcome, Jenni. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Henry. And thank you to all for joining us today. I know it's lovely outside and it's lunchtime, so it's really great to be able to share some information about soil with you. If you just bear with me while I fiddle about with my screen. Okay, so today, as Henry said, is part one of 2 talks, and if you'll forgive the cliche, today is all about getting us on the same page. I know that there is a variety of experience and knowledge about farming and soils. We've had a look at the attendance list. It's great to see such a diversity. But we felt it was important to get some fundamental ideas about soils out there so that we can be better informed for the next talk, where we can really start to think about any specific questions that you have. But hopefully some of them will be answered today. So, so what I'm going to cover is I'm going to have a little look at recent policy, soil policy for farming in particular, of course, and why, if you're not interested in soils, you might want to get interested. I'm going to look at the soil types in the North Wessex Downs, and in particular focusing on the lime-rich soils, even though I realise there's a variety of them. And again, we can revisit more when we come back after Easter. Something about reading your soil structure. Soil structure may become a target for DEFRA to communicate with farmers about soils with, so we'll focus on that. We'll have a look at the life in soils and why it's important, and then just a very brief look at the type of management you might want to think about to improve soil health if you're not doing it already. I know lots of people are. So just to give an overview of the way that soil relates to this ambition of the government for farmers to deliver public goods. In 2019, when the government introduced the idea of the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which would take over post-Brexit, they outlined 6 key areas which they suggested they may consider payment for public goods. So all of these things: clean air and water, biodiversity, reductions in environmental hazards, including adapting and mitigating climate change, and of course enhancing landscapes, which is just right in the sweet spot of your ANOB. For soil scientists, we were super excited because soil had been really quite overlooked in government policy ever since I've been studying it, that's for sure. So, and those different categories that were potentially going to be in the ELM scheme relate really well to what we understand as soil functions. So you can see, obviously, great big soil dot in the middle, and then those ones around the edge are the 5 functions of soil. So recycling system for nutrients and organic waste, habitat for soil organisms, medium for plant growth, and systems for water supply and purification absolutely chime in with those ELMS categories. The other one, the engineering medium for structures, of course, soil underpins all of our, our buildings and whatever, but that's something I don't really get involved with. And from those soil functions, this has kind of developed into this idea of soils being underpinning the delivery of ecosystem services. And I think recently you've had a talk about natural capital. So those of you who attended that will know what I mean. And there are loads of these. And here are some of the ones which relate directly to soil functions. Key amongst these, obviously, food. Food production is really important, and sometimes it's overlooked when people talk about ecosystem services, and it's really what we're all here for. There are obvious ones related to water system, water supply, regulation, flow and wastewater treatment. The ones to do with carbon sequestration and moderation of extreme events and things like erosion, all to do with how soil helps to stabilise the environment. But let's not forget the biology. It's not just biodiversity that's important, but there are key groups of biological organisms which help us to produce food, so pollinators and biological control agents, for example. So all this, the things that were coming through from the government about ELMS were really good news for scientists, and we can see how we can really start to help farmers, maybe to get some extra reward by managing soils better. And right up to date, this dropped into my inbox this week, and I'm sure it did for most of you, an offer from DEFRA for farmers to get involved in sustainable farming incentive pilots. And if you have a look in there, there are lots of details about the kind of things which farmers might want to think about managing in order to attract various sums of money. And within those are wonderful to see the actual word soil standard in there. And of course, with things like water body buffering standards, soils are key for that, really important for your region. And I know that you're having a talk about hedgerows, so you're getting a good deal from your AONB here. So do have a look at that, and it might be an idea if you think about how you can contribute to that, those pilots. So getting down to it, so I used to live near to Bristol actually, and my dad lived in near to Oxford, so I used to travel quite regularly through your region, and I think it's very nice too. So I am familiar with it, but maybe not so much with your your pretty unusual soil types. So here is the map of your area. So I investigated your soils using the Soilscapes app. Now, throughout my talk, I'm going to give you lots of links to free resources that are online where you can, you can follow up if you want to and get more information. So if I just get rid of the underlying map, you can see the different soil types in your region. Okay, and all this is free. Go have a look at it. Obviously, the most, the special areas in your AONB are the shallow lime-rich soils over chalk, your downlands. And I am going to focus on those today. I don't have much time to really get into different soil types for the whole of your region. But this is, this is a specialty, if you like. So it's very interesting for me to understand more about them myself. So you've got these upland areas, which are these lime-rich thin soils, and then going down through the different soil types, becoming, thicker as you move down the valley, and more acidic, and then to your much more clayey soils that are more acidic at the bottom of the valleys next to the kennet. So this is the kind of information that you can get if you can download the same information onto your phone using the My Soil app, which is produced by the British Ecological Society. And it's on your phone and you've got a signal and you're standing in a field, you can tap the screen, it will find you and it will tell you the kind of soil that you should be on, plus all sorts of other things like depth, about its fertility and those sorts of things. You can also access this, when you're not on the field or you're anywhere, by just putting in the postcode or some map coordinates. So absolutely fantastic free data that's available to you. So really getting down to fundamentals now, regardless of which soil it is, how do we think about its composition? What's the recipe for a soil? Well, this is the kind of pie chart that you'll see, which shows that soils are mostly minerals, which obviously come from the bedrock underneath. They are about, well, in general, sort of average is 5% organic matter, but that can vary very widely. And the other parts of soil are water and air. Now, the things which a farmer can manage are the amount of organic matter in the soil, the amount of water and the amount of air. You can't do much about that mineral component. And usually when I'm talking to people who manage the land, recently, if you look at the picture at the bottom of your screen, I'm usually talking to people who have very saturated soils or very flooded soils, which are to the right there. But your soils, because they're so freely draining, especially the upland ones I'm referring to now, the chalky soils, are often in water deficit. And I know that this is a problem for you that perhaps most farmers are experiencing. The optimum soil water content, soil air content rather, is about 20 to 30% each. So if you think about managing your soils to achieve that, whichever you're interested in, probably in a droughty summer, you'd be much more interested in the soil water content, too much air in the soil. So if you think about your soil in that way, it's, we can think about how we might get to manage that by managing things like organic matter and structure. So the mineral part of your soil, the majority of the hard, the residues are soil minerals, and they all come from the underlying rock. So in your area, this is a soil texture triangle. You can find one anywhere online. Your soil is defined by the amount of sand, which are large particles, silt, which are medium-sized particles, and clays, which are small particles. And your soils tend to be around that brown, loamy area there, and perhaps into the silt loams in particular. If you don't know what your soil texture is and you're interested in really getting to grips with your soil, there are quite a lot of there's quite a lot of information, very well established ways of hand texturing your soil. You can see on the right, this is something which was put online as part of a soil and earthworm survey by Imperial College in London. It's a really fantastic resource. There are also videos and stuff if you want to go on there which show you how to do it. So you can, through touch, through manipulating the soil, making it into balls and ribbons and whatnot, you can work out more or less what your soil texture is. And you can also do things like the mason jar soil test, where you put some soil and water in a jar, shake it up and down, and because of the different weight, the different densities of those different particles, they sediment out at different rates, and you can actually work out percentages of each particle size, and then work out your soil texture. So have a go at that. So it's a lot of fun, and it will really get you to grips with your soil. So soil profiles, clearly, if you look at the soil profile in your area, in the upland parts I'm talking about, you have very thin topsoils overlying what can be almost pure chalk. And this is part of the wonder of your area is this particular geology. Now that chalk, as you might know, used to be seabed and is actually made up of these lovely sort of microorganisms called coccoliths, which lived in the warm seas of the Cretaceous period and died and fell to the bottom, and were forced upwards by geological change, and become the bedrock underpinning your soils. Now, the difference between your soils, and I don't have to tell you this, is that number one, we call them rendzinas, soil scientists do, and the difference between this and something like a brown earth is this large topsoil difference between the topsoil here and the rock. The bedrock is a large, you've got a lot of depth there, where of course in your soils that it's actually not very far down until you start to hit bedrock. And again, free resource, the soil geology phone app called iGeology, also British Geological Society, and you access this in the same way, and it has the same functions as My Soil, all fantastic and free. So again, if you don't know your pH, there are easy ways to find out if you have an alkaline soil. So chalky soils are alkaline because they are made of calcium carbonate. And if you don't have any other resource, then you can use the fizz test, as is called by soil surveyors, where you take an acid like vinegar and you drop it onto the soil, and it will fizz if it's got lots of calcium carbonate in it, so you have an alkaline soil. So you can also buy pH tests, you can buy pH meters fairly cheaply. And the reason this is so important is that chalky soils, alkaline soils, have problems potentially if they tie up different kinds of elements which you might like to be more available. Things like phosphorus, iron, manganese become less available the higher your pH, and this can be important if you're growing crops, and particularly if you have livestock who are grazing plants growing on these chalky soils. So go and have a go at that soil pH test. This is absolutely derived from the way that soil surveyors used to work out the kind of soil that they are surveying, and there's actually a scale of fizzing as well if you're interested in that. So your characteristic thin topsoil horizon is very thin because your soils develop very, very slowly, and that's because the chalk dissolves away, leaving only a minor amount of more stable residues which form this kind of silty clays. So it's not just that you have high rates of erosion, your particular soil type develops very slowly. Here's a beautiful picture of your downland, and you can see this particular feature which is called soil creep. So this is just your thin soil which is moving under gravity down the steep slopes, but obviously exacerbated by perhaps overgrazing, those sorts of things. And also, if you have bare soil when it's very windy, the soils are light and they can blow away. And I believe in your area, the high organic matter soils, which are mixing with the carbonates, turn this into something which is described as black puff. And all of this is even more important now, understanding the fundamentals about soil, because climate change is making it much more difficult to farm, but to manage your soils to accommodate changes in climate. This is the most recent metric from the UK Met Office, and it shows you the general situation for the UK over the last 10 years. So there's been a big increase in rain. We now get more than 10% extra rainfall than we did in the 2000s. You know, it gets loads, it's much more stormy, but we also have warmer temperatures and much less frost. So things like frost heave, which is actually something which drives that soil creep, are actually less than they were. And because of this, whatever situation we're in, whatever soil type we're on, understanding how water flows through soil is now more essential than ever. And this diagram shows you a very simplified illustration of the way that water flows in the soil. So we have pathway 1, which is surface flow, and really we never ever want to see water moving across the surface of any soil. Pathway 2 is where we want the water to be for crop growth, and pathway 3 indicates water that's moving through the soil and into the underlying rock, and this is our aquifer, our groundwater. Super essential for your area, because most of your area is not only a nitrate vulnerable zone, but also a drinking water safeguard zone because of this aquifer for drinking water for conurbations, urban populations across the south of England. Now, whatever you do to the surface when you're managing it affects the flow of water through these pathways. So we really, really need to get a grip on soil drainage now, not only in soils that are very wet, we need to drain them, but we also need to think about these pathways of water flowing through our soils for well-draining soils. So obviously from the point of view of water quality, because nutrients can get into freshwater supplies and sediments become a problem if they move across the soil into waterways. Drought prevention leads to yield reduction, and I think that in your region, in the chalky soils, you can often be in moisture deficit, which is again something which many farmers, don't suffer from as much as people in down uplands. Controlling water flow through the soil. Last 2 years ago, actually, there was some dreadful flooding around Newbury, and this is all for the fact that upland areas are draining too quickly, if you like. So we need to not only prevent water flowing across the surface, but we also need to slow it down as it moves through that soil profile. The maps on the right show you again some information from the Met Office, and you can see that in your region that temperatures are up, sunshine hours are up, but you also have more rainfall, so suffering the same problems as the whole of the UK. So your soils present both opportunities, because they're free draining loams, which under the right circumstances are the most fantastic soils to manage, partly because they are relatively resistant to compaction if you compare them to a heavy clay that's very plastic and deforms under pressure. They're lime rich, which means they're reasonably fertile and they buffer well against things like acidity. So this makes them suited to spring and autumn sown cereals. Getting an autumn crop in the ground now under climate change in most areas in the UK is a huge challenge. You have amazing diverse native flora. Your soils warm up quickly and they hold on to nutrients and carbon pretty well, again, because of the lime actually makes this an advantage. However, your challenges are that your soils are very prone to drought, to the leaching of nitrates to groundwater, They're thin and stony, which can make it really hard work, and you know, to work with steel, and you know, for instance, wear and tear can be much higher on your soils than they are on other soil types. Your soils are prone to surface capping, even though you have you know, very forgiving soils in terms of compaction. Surface capping can be a real problem. Erosion of soils on steep slopes we've seen, and this vulnerability to nitrate leaching can lead to nutrient enrichment of water sources and silting of your beautiful chalk streams. So perhaps we think about some of the methods to manage challenges by understanding your soils better. So I said earlier on that that soil structure may be something which DEFRA were thinking about in order to work with farmers towards you know, BPS payments. So this again is some very well-established methodology for understanding the physical structure of your soils and where you might improve structure if it's not so great. It's produced by Scotland's Rural College, but you'll find it in AHDB guidance, and most guidance now will include this visual examination of soil structure. It involves digging a hole, you know, and getting the soil out and having a look at what it looks like, how it feels, how easy it is to break apart. And there are a range of key diagnostics that you can look at. Now, this isn't just for light soils, of course. This is relevant to all soil types. And the important thing about this is that it gives you a score. So if somebody's interested in the structure of your soil and wants to understand, you know, whether it's good or bad, then you can use this as a reliable scoring system to talk about your soils knowledgeably. There are other tools that you can use which are easy and free. You can set yourself up with an infiltration test. Now, again, you may have very freely flowing soils, but you need to know if you've got a surface cap. This is a test which you can do. Just take what we call an infiltrometer, but you can call a pipe, stick it into your soil, fill it with a known volume of water, and time its movement into the soil. And there are other things like penetrometers, which you can use to understand whether you have compaction and the depth of your soil without digging a hole. And if you're lucky enough to have subsoil, you can use this subsoil visual examination chart, the sub-phase flow chart, which does a similar sort of process for the subsoil. So you can have topsoil and subsoil, all free. If you go onto the website, there are videos showing you how to do it. So of all the indicators of good soil health, the one that I'm really familiar with and that I've been exploring and investigating for quite a few years now with farmers and in the scientific setting is the relationship between soil health and aggregate stability in water. Now, it all started because of this video, really, that my friend Chris Watts at Rothamsted showed me. So these are two aggregates. They're about 1 centimetre in diameter, and they are the same soil, taken from two plots of land side by side, one which is under grassland, the one on the left, and the one that's been under long-term arable on the right. And the way they behave in water, that's all this is completely contrasting. And the only difference between these two soils is the way they've been managed, and which has given rise to different amounts of soil organic carbon. So if we look at what's going on in those soils, you can see on the left that this is the grassland soil. Even just looking at closer up with your, you can see that there are fine roots and goodness knows what sticking out of it, and those are binding it together. Under a microscope, which is the picture below that, you can see that there are lots of fibres and gels and stuff holding the soil together. Compare that to the picture on the right, where you have the aggregate that's slaked, and you can see that the same soil just looks like a pile of rubble there. So the difference between these two is the carbon, which is in that soil, which is feeding the soil biology, which is holding the soil together. If we take a close-up of this illustration, you can see that how aggregates are really quite a complex system. They've got big things like roots and fungal hyphae holding pieces of fragments of rock together, your minerals together, and on those and between those are partly degraded soil organic matter, which is colonised by bacteria, fungi, all working together to hold the soil together. And of course, there are also other types of animals living in that soil, not just microorganisms, so things like springtails, mites, and earthworms, all working together to hold your soil together. And all they want is a soil organic matter meal. And where you have, particularly mineralogy like yours, with lots of calcium, there's also attraction between the clay particles, which means that your soils are more likely to aggregate anyway. So in some ways, you're very lucky because your soils are so well structured naturally. So if you want to understand more about your biology, there are some interesting things that you could do. The biology in your soil is responsible for the decomposition and turnover of crop residues and the organic matter in your soil once it gets into the soil profile. And the way that you manage your soil affects the ability of those organisms to do that. So this was a really fun, high-profile project which was run by lots of farmers across the UK. It was in the Farming Press quite a lot a few years ago, the Soil My Undies campaign. And I've taken these pictures from an HDB version of this project, and it's pretty easy to see that these cotton pants, which have been buried under different management types, have decomposed in sort of minimum till situations compared with conventional ploughs. And it's one of the best indications that there's something going on in your soil. The cellulose in those pants is being degraded by an active biological community, particularly where you have overwinter cover crops and strip till. Quite a stark difference between those. Easy to do, and you might want to go and have a go. Something a little bit more scientific, if you like, is the tea bag test, and this was something which was started by a group of researchers in the Netherlands, and they wanted to produce a protocol that everybody could use to understand the rates of breakdown of different types of organic matter. So they chose two particular types of tea, and you can bury them in your topsoil, dig them up and weigh them, and the difference between those two will tell you about how different groups of microorganisms, the ones that turn over the fastest breakdown, the fastest breaking, the labile carbon and the stable carbon in your soil, how they're working at different rates. And this is a farmer called Pat Thornton over in Lincolnshire who took this idea and did it with a group of farmers who work BSF, the Real Results farmers. And you can also put the information which you gain from doing this into a database, a citizen science database, and contribute to a Europe-wide database to understand how soils are functioning on farms. Again, it seems like a lot of fun, but the science behind it is quite robust. Earthworm counts are one of the most popular ways of understanding your soil health, and again, it's easy to do because they are large, and we understand their biology very well. And there are three basic types. So they are the ones which live on the surface amongst the degrading litter. They're called the epigeic type. There are these other guys that live in the soil itself. They don't move around very much, but they process the semi-broken down organic matter that's in your soil. And then there are the champions, which are you will often see on if you're interested in earthworms and soil health, these anesic types, these deep burrowers that produce vertical burrows. Now, in the thin soils, you may not see so many of these great big ones because earthworms are very sensitive. They hide away when it's cold or dry. They're very sensitive to water content of soils. If you have a waterlogged soil, they'll drown or they'll come to the surface and die either by exposure or because birds like to eat them. You'll see lots of birds stamping on the soil and bringing the urns up when it's wet. But they're also sensitive to UV light and they're sensitive to acidity. So in alkaline soils like yours, they'll do very well if it's moist enough. But even if you pick up an earthworm and hold it in your hand, the acidity of your hand will make it writhe about. So do be careful if you do any of these tests, these poor things. But do remember, if you're going to do some earthworm tests, when you're comparing your study to other people's, think about the ecology of those earthworms and whether you're actually likely to find lots in a thin, dry soil. So choose your time of year carefully. Again, lots of really fantastic free information around. This is the same resource as the hand texturing leaflet. If you want to understand more about earthworms, you can use this earthworm guide. When you take your practice, if you do a visual examination of soil structure, you take your soil and then you look at the structure and then you can collect your earthworms at the same time. If you do this, you can actually again contribute to a citizen science project that's been running across the UK, run by the Natural History Museum. So perhaps if you're interested in those animals, you can have a deeper look through using this identification guide. Of course, earthworms are the big guys in the soil, and most of the things which are helping to deliver these ecosystem services from soils are much smaller. And this picture on the left here shows, if you can get your eye in, there's a young wheat root. You can see the root hair sticking out into the soil there. The granular bits, they're actually soil particles, and between those you can see the soil pores where the animals which are doing the nutrient cycling and all the rest of it are living. So on the bottom right there you have a collembola, over on the left you have a mite, and between those you have mycelia from fungi and small bacteria living on the actual soil particles, all working together in a community which is no less busy or diverse than what's going on above the soil. You have to feed these guys if you want them to work for you. All they want is some organic matter. They're highly specialised to use carbon. They've been, associated with plants and plant roots for, billions of years. So if you look after them, they will work for you. Some of them use the soil carbon to physically change their environment. So as I said, these bacteria, the fungi, the mites, they're all part of the system which is working to make aggregates in your soils, because that's basically where they live. So it's to their advantage to pull these soil particles together in order to provide them with a home, if you like. They're very hungry most of the time. Carbon is actually a nutrient for them because they can't move and they're very small. Is actually always, in a luxury if they can get to it. So if you put something into the soil, it will be decomposed. I don't think there's many things which can be put into the soil, including plants and tea leaves, which won't be broken down pretty quickly. So talking about carbon, if you know me at all, you'll know that I think soil organic carbon is the most important element in soils because it drives all of these different services. And I'm not the only one. I stole this slide from somebody I work with in Ohio in the States, because I think it shows really well the relationship between increasing soil organic carbon and improvements in soil health or soil quality. So on the top line in red, you have all of the things which improve your agronomic productivity, which relates obviously, hopefully, to money in the end, including soil biology. So nutrient use efficiency increases and nutrient retention increases, soil aggregation increases, water use efficiency increases. And on the bottom, you have the things which are reduced by increasing soil organic carbon, and those are the negative aspects that we want to manage better. So erosion is reduced, runoff is reduced, soil crusting and compaction is reduced if soil organic carbon is increased. And hopefully, altogether, these add up to increased yield of crops and health of the farming system. So there's also the idea that we might get paid for increasing carbon in our soils, and that's definitely something people have been thinking about for a long time, if not for for about 20 years at least, because this is a picture of the carbon sequestration potential of England, which was produced by a group who were trying to understand whether you could increase carbon in soils by changing farmland management. And I've kind of circled the area which includes where your AONB is, and you can see that it's amongst the areas in England where there is a large sequestration potential. But this is built on the idea that it's not just increasing carbon, which is important, because this is about full carbon accounting. So you need to get the carbon into the soil, but you also need to reduce fossil fuel use and also mitigate other greenhouse gas emissions like methane and nitrous oxide. So this is full carbon accounting, and improving the structure of your soil, by increasing carbon is part of that, because soil becomes more workable and other greenhouse gases respond to management change as well. If you're interested in developing a full carbon account for your farm, you could think about using free online calculators like the Farm Carbon Toolkit, which was developed by farmers in the southwest of England, but is increasingly used across the UK. You may have seen Becky Wilson talking about this recently as well, and I'd recommend it. It's a really wonderful resource. So how much carbon can be stored in soils? It's absolutely true that the amount of carbon that could be stored in soils is finite. So you can't keep putting it in forever. But the amount of carbon which has been removed by agriculture is very large. So it's going to take the work that I've done personally shows that it takes sort of 20 or 30 years to recover a soil to full carbon sequestration or saturation, as this curve shows us. So say you're down here at the bottom on the left, in this brown area. This is perhaps conventional arable management, which has reduced the amount of carbon in the soil over time. And if you switch to a different management style or return something to permanent grassland, you will get a reasonably rapid increase in soil carbon, which will reach a new plateau, if you like, but that takes decades. And in terms of what we need to do in order to mitigate climate change, 20 to 30 years is probably about the amount of time that we need to develop the other technologies to stop using fossil fuels, basically, in order that we can mitigate climate change. And the reason I've put that bath on the right is when you're thinking about carbon in soils, even though sequestration kind of lends itself to the idea that you're locking carbon away, actually the carbon cycle, because of the biological aspects and all the rest of it that we want to be working for us, it's actually a very dynamic system. So to maintain the amount of carbon in the soil, you need to have inputs which at least equal the outputs. So perhaps the metaphor here I'm using is that the taps in the bath are what you control as a farmer, but the plug is always open. So it's a constant positive management of the situation to keep that carbon in the soil and hopefully to keep increasing it to a greater level. Now, payment for that needs to be recognised. So if you are at saturation, you need to be rewarded for just as much as the guy down the road who is at the bottom of that slope. So some interesting data about how much carbon is worth. So really this is being driven by banks, insurance companies, governments, who recognise that one of the only ways that they have to mitigate climate change, at least in the short term, is to increase carbon sequestration, but also to tax polluters. And so this carbon price is not just about what farmers may get paid for carbon sequestration, it's also about the amount of penalties that people who are polluting will be charged for that as well. Now, what's interesting about this, and if you've been watching the carbon trading market that's developed in the US, you'll know that the reward for sequestering carbon at the moment is pretty small. I think it's $20 or $30 per tonne of carbon, which isn't very much. But it's projected to grow very much into the future as we become a bit more desperate because the impacts of climate change become more profound. So use that information in any way you want, but I think if you are interested in developing carbon credits as part of your portfolio into the future, you might do well to keep an eye on how those prices are going and to question anybody who's asking to, to basically for you to sell them your carbon at the moment. So can you measure carbon in farm soils? Well, this is another question, which is something which I explored. We did a big project in the Tamar Valley, and we also did one in the Cotswolds. So we were looking at two different soil types. In the Tamar Valley, obviously, much heavier grasslands, wetter environment as well. And we used the Cotswolds as a contrast. And if you look at the soil profile there, you can see it doesn't look that much different from your chalk downlands. This is more limestone rock under here, but there's still very thin soils, silty loams over Cotswold brash. So the little stars on the map there are the farms that we visited, and we looked at different land use types, so arable, lay arable, pasture or woodland, to compare them to see if there was any difference in soil carbon. And what we found was, yes, there was. And basically, you might be surprised to hear that cultivation reduces the amount of carbon, and putting soil into something more permanent like pasture increases the amount of carbon. What is pretty exciting about both of those projects, though, was that when we looked at how the aggregates behaved in water, so we took them away, we dried them out, we put them in water, and we saw how quickly it took them to slake. What we observed in both projects was that there was a direct relationship between the amount of carbon in the soil and the rate at which the aggregate slaked. So this means that if you have no access to the analysis of the carbon in your soils, that you've changed your management, or you want to have a look at how things are going between different managements on the same soil type on your farm, if you use aggregate slaking, it will give you some idea about the amount of carbon that's in your soil. So you can see the direction of travel that you're on towards a more carbon-rich, healthy soil. So because you are in, particularly thinking about the downlands where it's drier, I just wanted to show you this picture. It's very difficult to find facts and figures about how much water organic matter can hold in soil because it will differ between areas. But this picture shows you how soil organic matter helps water management. The little, you can see there, the labels there show you that the water moves between these aggregates, but also the water inside those clusters, which are aggregates. That's where the water is, which is useful for holding onto water when it's droughty. So if you're into regenerative farming or you've read the press, you'll know about the different types of management which are being recommended to increase or improve soil health. So obviously minimising tillage to reduce the loss of soil structure and organic matter, inputting carbon, keeping your soil covered using cover crops, green manures, mulches, not just protecting the soil from the elements, but also encouraging biological activity like earthworms, Building a grass lane to rotation really helps, especially because grasses have large amounts of fine roots which stabilise soils which are friable, like the ones that you have in your uplands. So that's all I'm going to say. We're now going to have some questions. We've got lots of time actually. And can I just say again that there will be another session on after Easter. And the idea there is that we gather your questions and we actually answer some very specific ones which you might have about your particular soil type, your situation, and you can include those with your feedback at the end of this session, and they'll be fed through to me, and I hope that I can provide you with some more help then. But now over back to Henry for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. That was wide-ranging and absolutely fascinating. Now we don't have a huge number of questions at the moment. In fact, we haven't got any. So I encourage anyone who would like to raise a question now to put one in the Q&A. But remembering, if there are specific things you'd like tackled in part 2, then to put that in your feedback when you log out of the webinar. I have a question for you, which is really aimed at those of our land managers and farmers in the AONB who perhaps have been conscious of needing to do something about soil, but not really knowing where to start. If there was one thing that you would recommend that a farmer in the North West Extends should do, having seen your talk, what would it be?
Oh well, I think the digging a hole. This is the most fundamental aspect. Is to have a look at what your resource is. You know, it's amazing to have this. You know, most people just manage the top of what they could see. So you look at the crop yields. You may look at the surface, but actually finding out where your bedrock is. You know, finding out whether you have you know, lots of earthworms. Finding out you know, whether soil under one management is different from another management, and the effect you're having on it is you know, is kind of critical. And because that visual examination of soil structure is so well established now, and as I said, it looks like DEFRA are getting interested in that kind of approach through things like the Great Soils Project, if people have been involved in that, to understand how their soil's working and to be able to communicate to policymakers about it. That would be something which I would do. Earthworm counts, again, are something which is very easy to do, and also to communicate in terms of soil health. If you can start to measure your soil organic carbon or soil organic matter now, and start to keep a record of that, how it changes, that would also be something I'd recommend in terms of what I've heard of, you know, going through sort of policy about what might be rewarded. And why wouldn't you want to get carbon credits in the end if that becomes an option?
Okay, thank you very much. Now I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Corinna Woodall.
So Jenny, we've got a question here from Liz Mattison, who asks, we'd like to establish a baseline for soil organic matter and soil carbon to monitor progress going forwards, but how? Okay, so there are I can't recommend any of the analytical laboratories. You know, they're all wonderful. But if you go and have a look at what's on offer from different laboratories now, analytical laboratories, some of them have soil health packages now, which include soil organic matter, but other things as well. So on top of your standard PK mag, you can also, you know, slot on a soil organic matter measure at the end. I would say that the Farm Carbon Toolkit, that if you have a look at their website, it's because it's run by farmers, there's lots of information on there which is entirely relevant to what you're trying to achieve. And there's also a very big project, the Soil Carbon Project, which is being run across the UK. So you can have a look at the kind of things that other farmers are doing. You can look at the results so far of these wide-ranging surveys that Becky's been doing, and perhaps you know, get some idea of the protocols. We're trying to develop a standard protocol that everybody uses, so that when you send off a sample to a lab, you know you're taking your sample in the same way as somebody else on another farm is, so you can then think about comparing. But what I would say as well is that because of the difference in soil types and climate and all the rest of it, comparing between farms, between landscapes is you know, is something which is, you know, you may find disappointing. For instance, when we did the Tamar project and compared it to the Cotswolds, the guys in the Tamar, because they, you know, a lot of them under grasslands and all the rest of it, expected to have larger soil organic matter content. And actually they didn't. The people in the Cotswolds did, because they had, you know, they're under, you have these alkaline soils. So what I would suggest is, if you're going to start doing this, forget about what everybody else is doing. On your farm, go to places that you're interested in. If you're looking at within one field, take a sample in the middle of the field, take another sample, you know, under the hedge or whatever, a place where you don't cultivate, because that's where you'll see the biggest differences. And potentially, if you're thinking about the bottom and the top of that slope, what you'll see under a hedge or in a, you know, or in a long-term permanent grassland will be the max you can get to if you're in an arable situation. So perhaps if you've got the resources, play around within your own farm and look at, you know, look at areas that you can see contrasting. If you haven't got any money to do lots of soil testing, then do what you can, but do try doing that aggregate stability test. We did publish a paper which has got a scale in it that you can use, which I'll be happy to share if you're interested in doing that. It's so easy. It's so easy. Just get hold of the aggregates, leave them, you know, somewhere dry overnight, and then compare them just by dropping them in water. You actually put them on a sieve and you dunk them into water. So it's all really doable, and you can achieve a score which you can then talk to people about, you know, your results in a meaningful way.
Great, thank you, Jenny, and Liz has responded. Thank you, and yes, please. We have a message from a question from G Morris, which is, do arable fungicides kill beneficial soil organisms?
Well, it depends on the situation, doesn't it? And how well you use the fungicides. I mean, fungicides are meant to work on foliar fungal pests. So if you apply them in the right way, I suppose that the theory is that they don't have any effect on soil organisms. There's quite a lot of research out there suggests that that there's so many different circumstances, but a fungicide is a fungicide, isn't it? And a fungi is a fungi. They work in the same way. So yeah, I would say if you're going to use crop protection products, use them well. You know, the other end of this argument is that if you do have a fungal infection on your crop, you know, that it's not as healthy, the crop isn't as healthy as it could be, and therefore, you know, the biology in the soil isn't as healthy as it could be because the inputs are different, you know. So, you know, it's all, I think it's all about using what you can. It's about integrating it. It's about understanding the relationship between different systems, and you know, using what you need when you need, rather than, you know, putting it on just in case. But obviously it takes more time. It takes more time to work those things out, you know. But I hope that your agronomist would be able to help you with you know, best practice applications.
Thank you. I think we're almost out of time, but let's see if we can squeeze in one last question, Corinna.
We've got a question from Jonathan Capes saying, starting regenerative agriculture on arable land, moving away from a high input regime, has a difficult weaning period before increased soil organic matter benefits are shown. How to achieve this with least yield and financial loss?
Right, well, I can only talk to you about you know, when I've spoken to other farmers about this, and I know that, you know, if you're really interested in this sort of thing, then joining Base UK was probably a really good place to get, you know, information from people who have gone through the same thing. Now, it all depends on where you are and all the rest of it, but what I've heard is that there's the pain period's about 3 years. Okay, but what I would suggest is that you don't need to learn from scratch. You know, there are lots of people on the same journey, and some of them a little bit further down the pathway, obviously, than you are. So don't start from scratch. Go and talk to as many people as you can and get as many, you know, as many good ideas. Learn about their experiences, what worked, what didn't, and work on that basis. But from what I hear, it is a few years. So perhaps you need to, you know, prepare for that period of difficulty. Diversification, you know, think of other things which you can use to you know, bolster your income while you're going through that. But transitioning slowly, you know, don't do it to the whole farm. You know, do particular fields and feel your way. But I would say, I'm very happy to talk to you about soil science. But you know, putting a farm, changing a whole management regime on a farm is something I would probably want to speak to other farmers about if I was you. And there are lots of people who really, really want to help each other, and they help me, you know. So yeah, that's what I'd suggest.
That's brilliant. We've run out of time, but there've been some brilliant questions. So thank you to those who've asked questions, and thank you very much, Jenni, for a fascinating talk and some excellent answers. I'm sure everyone's really looking forward to part 2. I also want to thank Anna Trant, who's been running this event behind the scenes for us, and Shepley from the AUNB team, and Corinna Woodall, who has put the whole programme together. Just a reminder that the next of our webinars is going to be on the future role of hedges. You can see the link to that for booking coming up in the chat now, on the 25th of March. And then, as you can see on the screen, Jenni's second talk, Digging Deeper into Your Soils, part 2. We still don't have very much information from DEFRA about the Farming in Protected Landscapes programme. Therefore, the 23rd of March webinar will be giving an update on the latest with agri-environment stewardship schemes and how to get the best for your business, with all the latest information we have there. And can I just remind you all again, please, if you have anything that you'd like asked or any subjects covered in Jenni's next talk, to write that down in your feedback as you leave the webinar now. It just remains for me to say thank you all very much indeed. Goodbye.